Hi, Kate Malberger here for another installment of How Should I Quilt This Quilt? I'm excited today to get started on a quilt that I've been working on for 10 plus years now. It is a Baltimore album style hand appliqued Halloween quilt. And most of the time I'm only inspired to work on this in September and October every year. So it's taken me quite a while to get the applique done. That I finally finished that last year, and I got the blocks sewn together and the quilt basted actually last winter. And now that September and October are rolling around again, I'm ready to get it quilted. So let me show you the quilt. So this is going to be a wall hanging. It's about 52 inches square. The blocks I think are only about 9 or 10 inches each. And for now, I have basted the quilt already with safety pins. And as usual, I always start by sewing around the outside edge just to make sure everything is nice and flat and basted. My next step, I think, on this quilt is going to be well, on every quilt, my next step is to anchor it. So what that means is I'm not going to start in this corner and do all kinds of crazy quilting. I want to do just a little bit of quilting over the whole thing. So for this quilt, I think I will do in the ditch around both sides of the bats, around both sides of the gold border, and then I will do in the ditch around each of the units of each block. And that's going to take a little bit of time. But that way I will have a little bit of quilting in each block to make it stabilized so that I can then go in and do concentrated quilting on each individual block as I decide to do that. That is as far as I've gotten in the planning process. So I will go ahead and get started on that and report back on my next step. Okay, the quilt has been successfully anchored. I went in the ditch around the yellow border. If you look close, I did some echo quilting around all of the bats. And then in the center, I did echo quilting around each of the appliqued units, just around the outside. I want to have a little bit of quilting in each area, but not too intense that it causes any puckering. So I think the quilt lays nice and flat right now, and I feel like it has been anchored. So now I can choose a block and go in and do some more detailed quilting to highlight some of the applique without distorting the rest of the quilt. I can tackle each block separately, and that's kind of fun to highlight each of these patches. And then I did a little bit of doodling with a chalk pencil. You can see my plans for the bats, and I have some 1-inch lines drawn in the purple. I'll probably quilt 1/8 of an inch on either side of those chalk lines to make a double line. So that's as far as I've gotten, and I'm going to probably first tackle each block and try to highlight the applique pieces next. Okay, the blocks themselves have now been quilted in a little bit of detail. I'll show you some of those highlights. First of all, each of the moon shapes going diagonally across the quilt, I did some cross hatching. Get up close here. On the moons themselves. That was my way of highlighting those. On leaves, I kind of used a gray thread and quilted some veins in the leaves. And I just kind of outlined the pumpkins. The cat itself, I left 3D. I just outlined that. This block was fun. Lots of fun things going on here. I have just out in the ditch around the owl, the ghosts have, because it was a white fabric and I knew detailed quilting would show up nicely, I went ahead and did some pebbling on each of the ghosts. I quilted the whiskers of the cat and more leaves. And then over here, I did a little bit of angle quilting to show the creases of the witches' hats. I think you might be able to see that. That's a very busy fabric, so I knew whatever I did was not going to show up real well. I stitched some straight lines to show the broom, a little bit of detail on each broom, and so on. Oh, the bats. Bats were fun. I put some quilting lines to show off the wings. I think I've highlighted everything in the ditch around the owl, of course. So this was fun. I'm going to finish up here with this block because this block inspired me on my next task, and that is to decide what I'm going to do in all of this light fabric background. I know that my stitching will show up there, so I wanted to do a pretty good job on the background fabric. So I'm going to take that cobweb and I'm going to duplicate that in these larger areas in between the blocks. There's 4 sections, and on the corners I think I have enough space here to maybe do a cobweb diagonally in the corner. And I'm just going to do that with a light thread. I don't want it to be black and in your face, but I think to have it be part of the background design will be fun. I did a little bit of practicing here. Grab that. I do this a lot. I just cut a square fabric and I drew my cobweb on there and then just did some free motion quilting all around it to make it pop a little bit. I have decided to use just white thread. I want the shadows to create the effect. I'm not going to have, I just did not like the dark gray thread or the gold in this particular spot. So I'm going to go ahead and free motion quilt, meander quilting all of the background and draw my lines and my diagonals for the cobwebs, and then this entire middle section will be finished. Okay, the center part of the quilt is finished. I'm very happy with how the cobwebs turned out. They're not glaring, but if you look at the shadows really closely, you can see them in the center of the quilt and on the corners. I have a little helper today. There's Claire. She's holding on to the quilt for me so it doesn't fall. My next step, I think, is going to be to go ahead and quilt all the bats around the borders. Yep, right there. Yep. And then I have to decide what I'm doing in that white border and the purple border on either side of the bats. But for now, I'm just going to quilt the bats. Yeah, quilt the bats. After looking at my previous installment to this video, I saw that you could not see the cobwebs as well. So I decided to lay this quilt in front of a window. I think you get a good view here of how I quilted the cobwebs in the center squares and in the corner. And it shows up a lot better here in front of this window where it's creating the shadow effect. As you can see, I did decide to go ahead and do the free motion meandering stitch in this white border as well. And on the bats, I'm going to turn here. You can see that I did the veins in the bats, just like I did in the center squares. These are just a little bit bigger. And then in the outside border, I went ahead and did a, it's like a crosshatch, but it's a double line crosshatch. It almost looks like a plaid going down through there in gold stitching so that it shows up a little better. I knew this purple fabric is a little busier and it wouldn't show up as well if I had matching thread. So the gold thread shows up a little bit better there. That's it, except my binding. I am done. And I'll quickly show you that. I'm going to use the faux piped binding, and I think it will give it a real nice look. So here it is, the finished quilt hanging. It's, as you can see, I did do the faux piped binding on the edge. It just adds another little strip of color. I pulled in the orange from the pumpkins that are in the corners, and I think that shows off the edges nicely. It's one of my favorite ways of doing binding lately, and I keep up with my blog. I'm hoping to have a video on there soon on how to do that type of binding. It really adds a nice finish. So I have another finished project. It feels so good, and I hope that you've gotten some inspiration and some ideas to help you finish up some of yours too.